In quotes, I worry about a world in which the rich get to write the rules. Those are the words of economist Angus Deaton. His work on reducing income inequality won him this year's Nobel Prize in economics. I'm going to try to explain it to you right now. Deaton wanted to look at the effect of taxation on poverty, but his approach was a little bit different. He looked at how taxation, not income, influences consumption. This to get a better understanding of living standards in developing countries. Now, the good news is this. Deaton thinks living standards have improved. The bad news, he thinks that for many, many people, things are very, very bad. I spoke to Professor Deaton not long after he found out he'd won the Nobel Prize for economics. I started with asking him how he feels about it.
Feels terrific. It's something, that, might happen, but it's not a high probability event. So it's been just wonderful ever since the phone call early in the morning, and it's gone on being wonderful. Perhaps the best thing for me is reading the wonderful things that fellow economists have written to me or written about me, and I really, really enjoyed that. It's terrific.
For our audience, the main basis, or I should say one of the key parts, is the fact that you've spent nearly a lifetime now writing about poverty, income inequality, and this has been a very big topic, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries as well. I wanted to hear your thoughts on the state of how the world is dealing with poverty and income inequality, and what you think that they are doing right, first of all. We'll get to what they're doing wrong later.
Okay. So I'm not sure who the world is here. I mean, this is individual people in individual countries struggling on their own behalf. And, it's not as if the world fixes these problems or even sets these problems. Just to make the obvious point, there is no world government that's responsible for eliminating or dealing with a global poverty in the way that the government of the United States has accepted some responsibility for poverty in the United States. So just to say what's been happening, I think in the world as a whole, there's been a huge improvement in the number of people living in terrible destitution, and those numbers have gone down very rapidly indeed in the last 40 or 50 years. And that's really the good news. The not so good news is there's still about 700 million people, according to the World Bank counts, who are living in something close to total destitution. So there's a long way to go. Inequality is a much harder issue, and it's much more difficult to measure. So I have thought about inequality all my life. One of the things I'm really delighted about is that we're talking about inequality in the public debate.
It seems to me that income inequality is a bigger issue than it was prior to the economic crisis. At least it feels that way. I'm wondering your thoughts on how a driving economy that's going forward, yet we have this major, major issue that continues to sort of weigh down citizens around the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. Just one thing, though, I think the rise in inequality in the United States and many other rich countries in the world started long before the financial crisis. It goes back to the 70s or so and has been, in many countries, including the United States, a pretty steady increase since then. In some countries, the financial crisis may not have made that worse. It makes it worse in the following way, though. If you live in an economy which is growing quite rapidly, you can give everybody, it's possible for everybody to get something extra. When the economy is not growing at all, the only way I can get better off is by taking something away from you. And so low growth financial crisis is a real recipe for distributional warfare, as it were, in a way that is much attenuated in more rapidly growing economies.
When you talk about distribution, a lot of people start thinking about different political aspects, for example, socialism, if you will. And there's been a lot of talk, especially here in the United States, as to the definition of socialism, and you hinted at it a little bit, which is taking some from the rich and giving it to the poor. And I'm wondering, longer term, that model, have you done any analysis on how that would work? And I know there are some smaller countries in Europe that have adopted that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure the word socialism, especially in the United States, is a very helpful way of thinking about this. And, socialism has many forms, all the way from democratic socialism, as you get in much of Western Europe, to the sort of Marxist socialism that you got in the former Soviet Union. That wasn't a great model. So we could talk more precisely, which I think is more useful in some ways, about redistribution from rich to poor. And I like to think of it not so much that way, but if you've got economic growth in the country, which for me is a terrific thing, I'm the last person to be opposed to economic growth. I think economic growth is the source of much that's good in the world. But if you have the economic growth, what tends to happen is that some people benefit more than others. So you get an increase in inequality because the people, some people just benefit a lot more than others. I mean, if you think of the internet revolution and so on, some people got very rich from that, a lot of people have not. So it's a disequalizing process, this technical change and economic growth. So my view is that it's really a good thing if that growth, those benefits could be spread widely around the population. Now, there's lots of ways of doing this. I mean, it's just that the people at the top ought to be helping share that. And you don't have to have what you might think of taking money away from one group and giving to the other. It's just that the rich pay more than their share for public health. They pay more than their share for education. They pay more than their share for defense. And that's just a way I think it ought to be. And it's a way in which the growth gets spread around to everybody. We don't have to think about this as someone sort of holding up a rich person with a gun and saying, I'm Robin Hood. I'm taking all your money away and I'm going to distribute it among the poor. I think that's an unhelpful way to think about it, and it puts people's backs up.
Let's talk about some of the solutions here. A lot of people say education is the key. A lot of people say that access to technology is the key. We can go on for quite a bit on this. And I'm wondering, from your opinion, last question here, what is going to be the key going forward over the next 5 years to fully address, or at least partially address, income inequality?
Well, I mean, education is always helpful, and it's a good in itself, and you don't have to, advocate for education just because it would reduce inequality. The same thing is true for technology. People ought to have that stuff. We shouldn't be justifying it because it does something else. So here's what I think is the most important thing we have to do about inequality. We have lots of tools. It's very easy to design different tax systems or redistribution if you have it, or anything. Increases in the minimum wage, which will change the distribution of income. What we need, though, is to have a real, lively, broad-based debate about what inequality does, what it's for, what its benefits are, what its costs are, and then we need to try to bring people together to come towards adopting the tools that we want to adopt. I don't think we have a shortage of tools. What we have is a shortage of political understanding and a political consensus about the sort of things that we ought to do.